What's growing on, gardeners? It's Friday, November 24th, and it looks like the chilly fall weather is here to stay on the southeastern coast of North Carolina. But that doesn't mean that we're not growing any more food, not by a long shot. That's why on today's video, I'm going to share with you 13 veggies that you can still plant out in your garden in December.
If you're new to the channel, please subscribe and hit the bell to receive new video notifications, and check out our Amazon store and Spreadshop links in the video description for everything I use in my garden and awesome custom designed apparel and other gear. Your support is greatly appreciated.
I live in a portion of southeastern North Carolina that was recently upgraded to Zone 8B in the most recent update to the USDA hardiness zone maps. However, you can still grow many of these things in significantly cooler climates than I reside in. And at the end of the video, I'm also going to show you a few cheap methods of protection that you can still grow out in your garden in the middle of winter in much colder zones. So stay tuned until the end of the video for some easy, cheap DIY cold protection methods. The first crop that you can plant out into your garden in December is garlic. Garlic is one of the most cold, hardy things that you can possibly grow in your garden. In fact, hardneck varieties of garlic are hardy down to Zone 3, so you can practically grow garlic all the way into the frozen tundra. In fact, it's actually more difficult to grow garlic if you live in a mild winter climate like I do than if you live in a cold winter climate. You see, in order to bulb properly come the spring, garlic cloves need to spend some time underground in very chilly soil. So for me, in a mild climate, I have to wait to plant out my garlic, whereas people that have lots and lots of cold weather, they can plant out their garlic in earlier fall. The only real requirement for planting garlic in a cold winter climate is that your ground is still workable. So if your ground hasn't frozen, now is a great time to plant garlic if you live in a chilly winter climate. If you live in a place with cold winters, you can grow either hardneck or softneck varieties of garlic. Hardneck varieties tend to be a lot stronger and more flavorful, but they need more cold weather. Softneck varieties will grow better in places with very mild climates like southern Texas and southern Florida, where you don't get a lot of chill. Now here in Zone 8B, North Carolina, I can basically grow both. This is a hardneck variety of garlic, but I did have to wait and have this spend a month in my vegetable crisper inside my refrigerator. That's refrigerator, not freezer. You can't store the bulbs in the freezer, but you can in the refrigerator. And this is a great trick to grow hardneck varieties in places with warmer winters. I order my garlic in September, it arrives in October, and I keep it in my fridge in the crisper throughout late October when I receive it, all the way until I plant it. And I typically wait until Thanksgiving weekend in order to plant my garlic here in Zone 8B, because by then the chilly weather is usually here. However, I could stretch this if I wanted to and go until the first week of December. And if you'd like more information on how to plant garlic, I will link to a video down in the video description that will tell you exactly how to do it. Veggies number 2 and 3 that you can sow in December are your typical bulbing onions and shallots. And when it comes to growing onions and shallots, timing is everything. That's because onions and shallots will develop the bulbs based on day length. Once the days reach a certain number of hours, that is what triggers the bulbing. So if you plant out your onion transplants too late into the year, they won't root enough and they won't have developed enough greens to bulb properly, and you will get very small onions. Onion varieties have to be selected based on the length of the day at the summer solstice. So if you live in high latitudes when summer days are very long, you have to grow long day onions. If you live in mid latitudes where the summer days are a middle length, you have to grow intermediate day onions. And if you live in low latitudes like I do, I live in the southern half of the United States, I have to grow short day onions because our summer days are not as long as places with higher latitudes. If you fail to select the proper variety of onion for your latitude, you will get poor bulbing. So for instance, if I grew a long day onion here down in the south, the days would never get long enough to trigger proper bulbing, so therefore I'd get small bulbs. Same thing would happen if you were to grow a short day onion up at a very northern latitude. They would trigger bulbing too early in the development process and you would not get proper onions. Now when it comes to growing shallots, it's a little more complicated because technically all shallots are long day, so when you live in a lower latitude like I do, it can become difficult. So what I've done is I've tried numerous different varieties of shallots, and I found that this Davidor variety grows very well in the south in the United States. It will still bulb. You will get pretty decent shallot development. So I've been very happy with this variety. Now, the reason why I recommend starting your onions and shallots in December is because you need to begin them in transplant trays. They do not grow well direct sown into the garden because the seeds are very, very tiny and they tend to wash away with heavy rain. So start them indoors. I start my onion and shallots inside roughly around Christmas time. So it'll be later December because the goal is to have 6 to 8 week old transplants to be placed out into my garden around Valentine's Day to the end of February, early March. I have found that getting them in the ground around that time will ensure that the onions and shallots root well enough and develop enough greens before the days start getting longer in April, May, and June. Doing this and having this timing, I've had the most success that I've ever had growing onions and shallots. So I've personally found that when it comes to growing onions and shallots, it's better to be a little bit early than a little bit late. If you've never grown them before, you can experiment and you can stagger your seeds by a week or two and have different plantings and then plant them out over the course of a few weeks, and then you can keep a journal and see which planting did the best. That is how you can learn how to nail the timing for your unique location. Veggies number 4 and 5 that I can sow in my garden in December are leeks and bunching onions. Leeks and bunching onions are both harvested for the green tops, not for the bulbs. So because of that, they are indifferent to day length. I can grow both of these year-round, 365 days a year, and you almost certainly can too. Now, when it comes to growing leeks, individual varieties of leeks may be more or less sensitive to heat and cold than others. For example, here in Zone 8, I'm able to grow this variety, King Richard, all year round. It is plenty cold hardy enough, and it is plenty heat tolerant enough for my climate. And I think that anybody in Zone 7 or warmer probably can grow this throughout the winter, no problem. If you live in a colder zone, you can grow something like Blue Soleils, which is hardy down to something like Zone 4 or 5, and as long as it's mature by the time late fall rolls around, they can sit in snowpack all winter long, and you can just go outside and pull them out of the snow as you need them. Now, if you live in a much hotter climate where it gets incredibly warm in the summer, like Vegas or Phoenix or areas of Texas, you can probably grow something like this underneath shade cloth. So if you happen to live in a very extreme climate, you may need to do a little bit of research for varieties of leeks because what you grow in the winter and summer could change. But for most of us, I think this King Richard variety is appropriate for year-round gardening. The real secret to growing leeks is to stagger your harvest because you don't want dozens of leek plants coming to maturity at the same exact time. You won't know what to do with them all. These are actually leeks that are left over from the summer. They were able to withstand the warmth here, and they are still standing out in my garden right now. These are all ready for harvest as we speak. I have a smaller planting of leeks over here that are not as far along. These will probably be ready within the next month or two. I have a smaller planting of leeks right here that is mixed in with my brassica bed that are months behind my other plantings. And then I have another package of leeks right here that I sowed about a month ago. These will be ready to transplant out into my garden in about another month once the central spears get a little bit thicker. And once they become thicker and more hardened off, I'll be able to separate each of these individual plants. So I have over a dozen plants that will be able to be transplanted out into my garden in this little 6-cell seed tray right here. And shortly I am going to start more seeds inside in my sunroom in one of these trays, so I can probably plant them out into my garden in something like January or February. So every 4 to 6 weeks or so, you can sow another tray full of leeks and just keep succession planting them out into your garden. Bunching onions can be grown on the same schedule as leeks. You can grow them year-round because we actually harvest these as green onions, the onion tops. We call them spring onions in the grocery store. I have had great luck with this Scarlet Bandit variety. It grows no problem year-round here in Zone 8. I think it would also grow year-round in Zone 7, and with a little bit of protection, you can definitely get down into Zone 6, maybe even colder. This is a very hardy variety, and it seems to resist heat as well. All of the onion plants that you see interplanted with all of my peppers are the Scarlet Bandit bunching onions. They are all harvested for green onions. You can see how the bulbs down here are all bunched together. You don't really use those bulbs. You're just going to come out with a pair of scissors whenever you need green onions, and you're just going to basically snap them off or cut them off, and then you cut them back, and then they will grow back. So having a few rows of these is really beneficial because these easily handle temperatures down into the teens in the winter, and when you grow them under a little hoop house like this, you can get a lot more mileage out of them. They are a year-round crop. Veggies 6 and 7 that you can still plant out in your garden in December are hardy lettuces and winter-type spinach. Now, cold isn't the only challenge that we deal with during December. One of the biggest challenges is actually the short days and the weak sun. The days are so short and the sun is so weak that even if you don't get really cold weather, there is a chance that that weak sun just can't generate enough growth on your plants. And the nice thing about spinach and leaf lettuces is they don't require a lot of UV radiation to be productive. If you have weak sun, you can still get growth out of them. Now, what I have found is that this time of year is generally too difficult to grow romaine type lettuces. They tend to get damaged a little bit when it comes to hard freezes, and also because they're larger heading lettuces, the UV radiation just isn't there for the growth that they demand. I have found by far the most success growing red leaf lettuces. They're the most cold hardy and they seem to grow the fastest. And I've had luck with the varieties Red Sails, New Red Fire, and Marvel of Four Seasons. They all grow great here, and I'll show you what some of them look like in my garden. Right here I have a bed full of collard greens and lettuce, and all of the lettuce that you see over here is the New Red Fire variety. It is doing great. They are all leafing out very nicely, and their growth has been accelerating by the day. I think this is going to make an excellent variety here in Zone 8. I'm sure it will do well in Zone 7 and even in Zone 6 or maybe colder with a little bit of protection. With this variety, you have the option to harvest them as a red leaf lettuce, or you could also wait about 2 months and they will eventually develop heads if you have strong enough sun. So you get some nice flexibility with this variety. I've been growing the Marvel of Four Seasons lettuce for 4 or 5 years here, and it's never failed me every year. In fact, it's gone to seed in the summer, so it just keeps popping up randomly throughout my garden. These are all heads of Marvel of Four Seasons from where they reseeded themselves from the spring crop where some excess heads bolted on me. And I have some that I sowed from seed that are just starting to germinate right now. Eventually I will have a whole row full of them. And here I have the Red Sails variety that is just starting to break ground. This is one of the most cold tolerant and heat sensitive of the lettuces that I grow, so it's one of the last things that I sow in my fall garden. And then there's spinach. When it comes to growing spinach, I find that depending on the climate that you're in, you really need to be careful if you're growing a winter type or a heat-resistant spring type. Now, here in North Carolina, it tends to get so hot so quickly in the spring that I can only grow spinach in the dead of winter. So it doesn't matter what variety of spinach I grow in the winter, they are all so cold tolerant that they do just fine here. It is the bolting problem that I have with spinach. Once March and April rolls around, it just gets too warm and they flower and they go to seed. So if you live in a much cooler climate than I do, I recommend that you get yourself a variety that is extra cold hardy. That way it can overwinter for you. And then in the spring, when you want to plant another crop, you get yourself a bolt resistant one. If you live in the south like I do, they're all pretty cold hardy. It doesn't really matter what you grow. But just be aware, spinach season in the south is very short. Crop number 8 that you can plant in your garden in December is arugula, also known as rocket. I look forward to this time of year because it is the only time that I can grow arugula in my garden. That is because it is incredibly sensitive to bolting. I can grow this in only the coolest 3 or 4 months of the year. And in my Zone 8 garden, I have never had any cold damage to my arugula. This stuff is as cold hardy as it gets. Planting arugula is about as easy as it gets. You'll want to direct sow this in your garden, make a little furrow or a little trench, and then plant the seeds about 1/4 inch deep, cover them up, water them in, and that's it. It's great if you stagger your rows a little bit because this stuff will go to seed even if you have an odd warm 3 or 4 days or so. That could be all it takes to send it into flowering. So it's great to have your rows scattered if you come out every 2 weeks and just sow a different row. That way you have them in different stages of maturity, and the way that you want to harvest these is basically with a pair of scissors. You'll just come in and then you'll snip the leaves off, You'll go, a few feet into the row, take what you want, and then that will grow back as long as it doesn't get too warm and they flower and go to seed. If you've never had arugula before, I strongly recommend it. It has a wonderful peppery, lemony flavor. It does great in salads to add a little bit of depth, and you can even cook them and saute them as a green. Veggies number 9 and 10 that you can plant out in your garden in December are herbs, the cold hardy herbs parsley and cilantro, also known as coriander. These are some of the most cold tolerant plants that I grow in my garden. Parsley is an extremely cold hardy herb. In my garden we've gotten as cold as 14 degrees Fahrenheit, and the parsley was fine, completely unprotected. It got a little bit of bronzing, some browning on some of the leaves, but then it grew right back and it grew throughout the year. This is much more sensitive to heat than it is to cold. In fact, in the summer it gets so hot here that I have to grow it either under shade cloth or I have to move it into complete shade. One of the biggest problems when it comes to growing parsley is just getting the seeds to germinate. It takes a very long time. I direct sowed some parsley 3 weeks ago and they are finally starting to germinate. You can see them coming up right here. It's usually easier to germinate parsley indoors than it is directly out in your garden. Parsley likes to germinate in that 65 to 70 degree soil range, so actually if you sow them indoors and you leave them in a sunny windowsill at room temperature in normal winter time or fall time room temperatures, that indoor temp is usually perfect. So I actually sowed some parsley seed in here 2 weeks ago. They still haven't come up yet, and what I find to be the easiest to trigger germination is to actually plant your parsley seed about 1/4 inch deep, water them in, and then boil a little bit of water and spoon a few tablespoons of boiling water on top of the seeds. That boiling water can actually help shock them into germination. So if you've had trouble getting your parsley seed to germinate, that is a trick that you may be able to employ and get better success. That being said, this is one of those plants that it's actually not a bad idea to just go out and buy a plant, then grow it from seed, because it is that tricky. Cilantro, also known as coriander, on the other hand, is very easy to germinate when you direct sow it out into your garden. I only direct sow cilantro. I never start it as transplants. The trick to getting it to germinate is you need really cool soil temperatures. You want soil temperatures that are in the 50s, maybe low 60s. Cilantro doesn't like warmth at all. It bolts faster than anything that I grow in my garden, with the exception of maybe arugula. Super sensitive to heat. I can only grow it when it is very cold out. The way I've learned to grow cilantro over the years is to let nature be my guide. I grow cilantro in the same spot for the most part every year, and when it bolts and goes to seed in the late winter, early spring, I let the plants reseed the ground. And then once I see the seed from the previous spring starting to germinate on its own, that's how I know the soil has finally cooled off enough that my cilantro will grow. So these plants in the back, they were reseeded from last spring's crop, and then I started direct sowing my cilantro, and then what you see here are seeds that I actually sowed myself. And I will continually plant cilantro seeds throughout the winter. Now, harvesting is very easy. Whenever I want it, I just come out and I snap some off or I cut some back and it will regrow, and I'll make sure to have numerous plantings of cilantro around my yard. It's also good to start some in the shade as well, especially when the days start getting longer and it starts warming up, because your cilantro that's grown out in full sun is going to be the first to bolt. If you grow some in total shade as well, that will be protected and you'll be able to grow it longer into the spring. End crops numbers 11, 12, and 13 that I'm planting out in my garden in December are carrots, radishes, and beets. Now I'm lumping these all together because they're all root vegetables, but the techniques used to grow them all are a little bit different. Carrots are by far the hardiest of the lot. Back in January 2018, we had a record 100-year freeze here, and we got all the way down to 8 degrees Fahrenheit, and that didn't phase the carrots at all. The tops turned bronze colored during the cold, and then as soon as it warmed back up, they turned green again, and it was like nothing ever happened. Carrots are a root vegetable, so they should only be direct sown in your garden. The hardest thing about growing carrots is getting them to germinate, because you sprinkle them basically on top of the soil and you only dust them with the lightest amount of soil, maybe 1/8 of an inch. If you use a furrow, it has to be very shallow. Because of that, rainfall typically washes them away. So in the past, I have advocated for actually planting my carrots underneath a wooden board and then keeping the area moist, but some of you you have said in the past that you've had those roly-polies come and take up residence underneath the wooden board and eat all of the baby plants. Well, if you've had that problem, you can also plant them underneath a piece of agricultural fabric. That's what I've done right here. You just keep the tops moist and they will eventually germinate in about 10 to 14 days. And that's what you're starting to see right here. These are the very first carrots that are beginning to germinate underneath that piece of agricultural fabric. Radishes, on the other hand, are one of the easiest things to germinate. Just like carrots, they need to be direct sown. And in this bed right here, you see mostly lettuces and radishes. And the lettuces are only just barely starting to break the ground. You probably can't even see them from here, but my entire row of radishes have already germinated. And before you know it, they are going to begin bulbing on you. The awesome thing about growing radishes is most varieties mature in only about 21 to 28 days. So within a month or less of you sowing the seed, you're going to have yourself radishes. Radishes are extremely cold hardy. As long as your soil is still workable, you will be able to grow them. So as long as you make it so that your soil doesn't freeze, you can keep planting radishes. Now, out of carrots, radishes, and beets, beets are probably the most cold sensitive. I have found that the beet tops, the greens, tend to take damage in the low 20s. They may even get a little bit bronzed or burnt from a hard freeze. However, because we are growing the beet for the root, as long as you don't allow your soil to freeze, the greens will keep coming back. Now, like radishes and carrots, you need to direct sow your beets, but I strongly recommend that you do so in succession. Don't sow a whole bunch of beets at the same time because they're all going to be mature at the same time, and what are you going to do with all of those beet roots? I recommend that you plant a little bit at a time so they will mature for you in all different stages. And that is precisely what you see right here. These are all beets that I sowed probably well over a month ago, and pretty soon they are going to start developing bulbs on the bottom. The greens are pretty far along. Now, this smaller row of beets that you see right here, I sowed probably only 3 or 4 weeks ago, and they are going to be roughly, I don't know, 3 or 4 weeks behind these beets. And then over here, I sowed even more beets just last week, and they are just starting to germinate. Now, each individual beet seed is actually a collection of something like 3 to 6 seeds. So when you plant your beets, you're going to have to thin them out. I'm getting them germinating all over the place. And guess what? In another few weeks, I'm certainly going to plant even more beet seeds. And as promised, even if you live in a considerably colder climate than me, don't think for a second that you can't grow many of these things throughout the winter. You see, all you really have to do is build yourself a cheap little hoop house structure like this, simply out of some PVC pipe or some half-inch electrical conduit and some PVC clips and one of these agricultural frost fabrics. Because even though it will still freeze underneath these hoop structures at night, they're going to do two things that are going to dramatically increase the hardiness of your plants. Number one, they're going to warm up during the day, even if it's very cold out, because they're going to trap the sun, and that is going to prevent the soil from freezing. It's not going to get cold enough long enough at night to freeze the soil solid because it's going to get so warm in there during the day. Also, number two, it is going to keep the frost off the leaves of your plants. Even though these structures will still freeze through underneath, you're not going to have that frost formation. And keeping the frost off the leaves is going to allow them to tolerate colder temperatures. So if you live in zone 6, zone 5, who knows, maybe even protected locations of zone 4, you will be shocked how much you can grow in your garden this time of year by building yourself a cheap little structure like these. And I will make sure to link down to a playlist below on how I build these DIY hoop house structures. I have many different videos on different types of builds. They have changed the way I grow my garden in the winter, and also they're even more helpful here in the summer because I can take off this agricultural fabric and I can put on shade cloth or insect netting and keep all of the pests off of my plants without using any sprays, and also keep the sun off when it starts getting too hot here in the coastal Carolinas. And that right there are 13 crops that I am still planting out in my garden in December. So everybody, I sure hope you found this video helpful. If you did, please make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and please ring that notification bell so you're notified when I release more videos like these. If you're curious about any of the products that I use in real life in my garden, they are all linked down below in my Amazon storefront link in in the video description. So if you expand the video description and you click on that link, you'll see everything I use in my garden in real life. And while you're there, check out my spread shop for custom merch if you want to support the channel. If you have any questions about the different crops that I mentioned in this video, please ask them down in the comments below, and I will do my best to address them. Thank you all so much for watching, and I hope to see all of you again on the next video.
Well, the 2 hounds are ready.
All right, it's time to cut the pumpkin pie for Thanksgiving. Who wants some? Well, I know some people that want some. Oh, I guess they don't want any. Oh, and of course, Dale is the one that stays behind the most. All right, Dale. Maybe we'll be able to give you one little taste of pumpkin pie. Anybody else want some?
Get them all in there.